cape.
Welcome, Wargamers. My name is Doug with 2+ Tough, and while I am still stuck in a giant snowstorm in Seattle, I don't have my battle tomes yet for Flesh Eater Courts or Skaven, so to make sure I have some videos coming out this week, I asked my patrons over on Patreon, who I am so grateful for, if they had any lore questions they wanted me to dive into. These are going to be much shorter, but there will be more of them throughout the week. The first question comes from Dan Yu. Dan asks, I have my own homebrewed Stormhost, Sigmar's Mercy, and the basic premise is they are doctors, surgeons, and healers. I like to think that they set up hospitals, but I don't have a point of reference on what that would be like. So actual question is, what is your take on medical care in the mortal realms? Dan, thank you so much for writing and, of course, being a patron. What I would say is there's not a ton of sources on like medicinal care or practice in any of the Black Library novels that I can think of. The two big ones that I want to share with today are, first and foremost, Gardas, Steel Soul from the Hallowed Knights. We know that in his first life, his previous life before being a Stormcast, he was a healer of some kind. It was part of a small village. The Nurgle's rot came to the area, and so he was defending and taking care of the sick and the dying, really defending them, watching over them, making sure their passing was as comfortable as possible during the kind of the beginning ages of the chaos. And so we see that he himself is a person of care and compassion, focuses on purity, things like that. Now, there's not a ton of information about his backstory, about his town, and what kind of medicine he practiced, but if you're looking for a source of inspiration for what does a compassionate, caring weapon of war, which is fundamentally what a Stormcast is, you can look at Gardas and across his multiple books, and you can really get a sense of that from him. In fact, your Stormhost Sigmar's Mercy is something that doesn't have to, but would fit in really well as being part of a Hallowed Knights kind of sub-chamber thing. So while it doesn't provide a lot of specifics, it's really a great model for creating intriguing characters. And so what I want to do now is actually show you the other source of inspiration, which I like quite a bit more. Some of you may know that Malign Portents came out last year, and it was a series of short stories culminating in what we call now Malign Sorcery, which is Nagash's Necroquake, his big thing to shake up and become a major player in the fight for the mortal realms. Well, what they did was they released a long series of short stories that are free. So if you just go online and type in malignportents.com, you can find some free Age of Sigmar lore to really dive into and absolutely enjoy. There may be like 4-page short stories. And so they're pretty great. Well, this one here is called Grim Deliverance. It's one of the first ones that was released. And if you're talking about medicine and doctors and taking care of people infected, particularly with Nurgle, but not exclusively, this is a great place to go to. And the reason I say that is, fundamentally what happens in this story is a Nurgle demon ambush comes into a Free People city. The Free People are actually able to push them back and win, and so they celebrate, have a great time. In the next morning, everyone starts getting incredibly sick. The reason is because they didn't account for the fact that everyone gets sick when Nurgle's around. It's not about fighting the enemy, it's about fighting the nature of disease and plague itself. And so we introduced to a female who is a nurse taking care of people. We don't actually know her profession, if she's a doctor. They just kind of say sister. Not quite sure what they're referring to, if it's like a religious order that does medical practices or if it's a doctor. And it actually ends up being a really cool story where she is trying to quarantine the sick. One guy has a cyst blowout, and she immediately, because she's so awesome and on the spot, spins around, pulls a hot sword out of a fire that was roasting there and jams it into him. Basically, they're using heat to cauterize wounds. Now, we know that's a common thing that used to happen, but it kind of gives you a sense of where they are on the medical history scale in terms of very rudimentary quarantine people, cauterize wounds. They understand diseases exist, how they function. They just didn't account for them in that specific battle. Ultimately, the disease kind of becomes too rampant until a dark wizard, or a death wizard I should say, comes in, uses death magic to basically squelch the life out of the diseases and save the day. And someone says, "Oh, thanks Sigmar, you're here." And of course this death wizard who honors Nagash is like, Sigmar had nothing to do with this. But I do suggest reading this. It is a very, very fun little story. Little things about how they quarantine people and the care and compassion that she demonstrates to people. Again, I don't know if she's just a normal person that they pulled off the street, or if she's a doctor, or anywhere in between. Like as far as a medical assistant, nurse, all those things, different echelons that we would know. And so it's a very cool story. I do recommend giving this a read. As far as AOS in general, we don't really focus on like what I would call practical medicine, like you and I would understand it. Because the story arc seems to follow a lot more with like infection and purification, not just on a physical level, but more of a spiritual one. People who are infected spiritually tend to look that way externally, and so that's kind of how they deal with that. So when you see people fighting forces of Nurgle, they describe them as being heavily plagued and stuff like that, but the real root of the cause is that they have fallen to chaos and that they are beyond redemption and that kind of thing. That's why you see a lot of themes of like purification, which is like redeeming Torglug and turning him into Tornus, the Stormcast Eternal, or more often than not, by purging, destroying the enemy, getting rid of the infection, that kind of stuff. However, on that note, I think a compassion, healer, medical focused Stormhost is an incredibly great idea. And the reason is because the characteristics of each Stormhost really dictate how they conduct themselves in war and give you a sense of what their internal struggles are, and I think that's super important. Having a Stormhost that their defining attribute is compassion can be really interesting because it can show you a different side of Stormcast Eternals. When they have to purge a population because they are just too far gone, you can get some great internal dialogue as far as like, this really hurts them to do that. They don't want to do what they have to do. It's a hard duty to follow. In addition to that, they can also be a Stormcast that is willing to take massive losses, sacrifice more than anyone else to save a few. Where other Stormcasts might look at a situation and say, it would have to kill 50 Stormcasts to save this group of 10 people. Most of them would not make that sacrifice, but these guys would. Again, their character defining how they conduct themselves in war is awesome. That's what Stormhosts are really about. Now, as I was thinking about this more and more, I was driving around, running some errands today, really kind of thinking about what a medical-based Stormhost could look like. And what's interesting and kind of struck me was that humans, as we know medicine, as you and I do, they have a long history of medicinal practices, some super dark and twisted that we don't want to get into, and some that are, very heartfelt, people trying to do the best thing with the knowledge that they have, and what medical advancements look like across that spectrum, and of course, time. And so what I'm thinking about is like your Stormhost units, like the individual units you have, they can all focus on different aspects of medicine across the ages, because frankly he picks people from all different, Sigmar picks people from all different times and locations. So my point in saying all this, your liberators could be the medical assistants. They do whatever the doctor tells them to do. They're more there for a lot of muscle, and frankly, I was a medical assistant for a long time. You're a muscle, you help people, you're driven by compassion, but you don't do the medical sciencey things. When it gets to your leadership and how they focus on doing combat, you could have things, like you said, like surgeons, which are very precise and very procedural, and that can definitely be a character trait inside, say, Lord Celestins or Jackoth Riders, things like that. But on the other side of the spectrum, you could also go another way and say that they are medicinal healers in the sense of like natural elements. We're going to come to this area, we're going to help the humans here cultivate the right herbs to be able to treat infections and things like that, doing a much more, again, naturalistic medicine type thing versus surgical and stuff like that. And what's awesome is none of these things conflict. They're all trying to, with a core central idea of compassion, help the humans and Dwarden and elves that are reestablishing from Azir into the realm. So like, it might seem like a contradiction that one might be more intelligent than the other, but they both get results and they both have the same heart in what they're doing. What else I like about this Stormhost idea that you have, Sigmar's Mercy, is that it gives you a lot of motivation for being places. And when I try to think of faction backstories that I like, that's kind of the defining thing, right? Why would this faction be here? I need to have a narrative reason why my army would be fighting all these other various things. And this is a great one because you have obviously your main one of, they're Stormcast first. They're defending people. They get sent to an area, they gotta defend it. It doesn't matter if they're doctors or not, they're warriors first. In addition to that every Stormcast has, you could do something like Sigmar learned that this area is being infected by Nurgle. Maybe it's not in Garion. but Nurgle spread elsewhere. We need to figure out what's causing these plagues. Is it a specific demon, or is it just being poured from nowhere? Send in Sigmar's Mercy. Let them go figure out the source of what's going on. That can be like a research team almost, but an aggressive one, obviously. So they can go out and fight other armies to figure out what's causing this disease. And the last one, and this is going to be one that can go as dark as you want it to go, is experimentation. By that I mean, do they have a cure and there's some sick people, so they go there and they're like, we don't know if this is going to help you, but we're going to defend you, monitor the results. You're going to die either way. Basically, here, try this like last hope, something like that. Or could it be that they do these quarantines on purpose to then try to experiment on people in other nefarious ways? Our human medical history has some pretty dark parts of it as well, where we did some pretty nefarious things. You can go as dark or light as you want. I assume you want to go more towards the light, super compassionate good guys. But again, that part exists where you're like, if they're all medical based, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. If I experiment on these 100 free people survivors, that's a good microcosm to test plague immunities on something else. So again, there's a lot of diversity of reasons of why they might do something. One thing that I would suggest you do is think about what happens to Stormcast that get reforged too much. There's some basic ones that apply to everything, like maybe losing their voice or something like that. But what does... it seems to be the case that when a Stormcast Eternal is reforged, whatever trait was their defining one, whether it's aggression like the Astral Templars, zealotry like the Hallowed Knights, it tends to get more extreme, right? Whatever it is, they get better at doing that one thing to the detriment of everything else. What would their thing be? Part of me thinks that taking missions that have like almost suicidal missions that have a super high attrition rate, because compassion overrides their sense of military, might, tactics and things like that, might be a really good starting point. Now, backing away from that, I'll be very clear that there's not a lot of model support for a hospital or medical themed thing. And if nothing else, I think if free people get a full model reboot, kind of like what Gloomspite gets did with a few new kits, I think a combat medic or something like that would be very thematic for them, absolutely. But in the meantime, things that if you're looking to do kit bashes and stuff like that would really go a long way are obviously your paint scheme. White is a pretty universal medical color, but you don't have to do that, obviously. In addition to that, things like satchels for carrying herbs and medicines and vials for potions and stuff like that, super thematic and would work really, really well. One thing that you could look at, and this is just if you snipe it off eBay for super cheap, is the actual orc from 40k, the unit called the Pain Boy. He has this hand that has a whole bunch of syringes and he has vials all over him and stuff like that. You could get one of those on the super cheap because they come in a start collecting box and people don't need a ton of them. And so you'll find them online for very, very low cost. You can actually clip those fingers off and you give them syringes and stuff around their hips for injecting cures and stuff like that. I think would be kind of a fun thing to do. So Dan, thank you so much for writing in. And of course, thank you so much for being a constant supporter. You and all of their patrons are awesome. And we're going to dive into more of their questions here this week. Thank you all so much for watching, and happy wargaming.
Hey Wargamers, Doug here. If you like the show, help the channel grow. Consider becoming one of my patrons over on Patreon. My patrons are vital to help decide the direction of the channel, and patrons of a certain level are automatically entered to win whatever battle tome I just finished reviewing. And I'll ship it anywhere worldwide. But more than that, it's an invitation to be part of a great group that wants to serve the wargaming community as a whole. Click the link in the description down below and you'll be brought over to my Patreon page, which is bursting with helpful information and will answer a lot of questions you may have. For as little as $1 a month, you can support me and make this channel possible. Thank you all so much for your consideration, and happy wargaming.